Just a brief outline of the key stages of this public consultation. Following the informal stakeholder engagement, which has led to the formulation of this draft guidance, we have commenced formal consultation on the draft LPG, which will run for over 8 weeks. This consultation will close on 27th of March. Following this, we will analyze the consultation responses and aim to publish the final guidance along with the EQIA autumn of this year. In this presentation, we will go over the background, the need for the guidance, and an overview of the guidance. And following that, we will focus on the design standards and an overview of the management plan. Our intention is to give you a feel of how this guidance has been developed and touch on some of the aspects of the guidance. The guidance itself, the document that is on our engagement portal, has much more details than what we will present today. So please have a look. Please keep your questions coming in the Q&A panel, and we will have a Q&A session after this presentation. Now over to my colleague, Michaela.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much, Monica. I am Michaela Smith. I'm one of the team leaders in the London Plan team, and I'm going to give a bit of a brief overview on background and policy context for the guidance and talk a bit about why we think the guidance is needed. So, large-scale purpose-built shared living, as Monica said, also known as co-living, is a form of communal living that provides private rooms for single adults alongside shared facilities to cook and dine and relax and socialise. And it's a form of non-self-contained accommodation, so it has a sui generis use class and is different, therefore, to traditional C3 self-contained housing. And as non-self-contained accommodation, the emphasis is on the quality of the communal space across the development. And so the private rooms are not required to meet minimum housing space standards in themselves, because your room is considered to be somewhere where you may retreat to, but on the whole, the wider development is meeting the needs that you would have for other types of spaces. Now, this doesn't mean that co-living is completely different from other forms of communal accommodation, and there is some similarities, although it is a distinct product in many ways. So it differs from HMOs or houses in multiple occupation due to its size in general, although you can get large scale houses in multiple occupation, and mainly the extent of the communal spaces and facilities that you find within. It also differs from hostels and hotels due to a requirement for a minimum tenancy of load less than 3 months. So these are not considered to be short stay places or accommodation. Unlike student housing, anyone can live in shared living. It's not there's no requirements in terms of age or the need to be in education or anything like that. And it can provide a very useful housing option for some, particularly single adults who are happy to share facilities for whatever reason, or who don't, or for whatever reason don't want to live in private rented sector accommodation. But it's not considered to be suitable for everyone or to be a form of accommodation that can meet general needs or long-term housing needs, albeit we recognise that it can be useful, as we say, for some people. Thanks, Monica. So the policy context for co-living development comes from London Plan Policy H16, which is large-scale purpose-built shared living, and it stipulates that co-living developments should contribute towards mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods. That's part of the kind of wider plan's overarching objectives for all accommodation coming forward. To be well connected in terms of being in areas that have access to local services and public transport. As these developments will bring significant numbers of people to the area, they need to be located appropriately. They need to be of acceptable quality and well managed, and management plans are an important part of this in the policy and the guidance. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. But the policy also introduces the requirement to make an affordable housing contribution. And to be clear, that's a cash contribution that would be used to deliver conventional affordable housing. Discounted co-living units are not considered to be acceptable forms of affordable housing, given that they don't meet conventional housing space standards. They're too small, effectively, and are therefore not suitable for general needs, affordable housing general needs. And the guidance we have brought out is seeking to expand on some of these principles largely, particularly how to deliver acceptable quality within these developments. So why do we need that guidance? Just as we've said, there's a growing market for interest in delivering co-living accommodation, with more and more schemes coming forward on the market. But as co-living is not subject to existing housing standards, it's fairly new in housing terms, there is sort of doubt and discussion over what sort of quality standards are acceptable and how to assess a scheme that might be in front of you if you're within a local planning authority trying to do so. So the guidance is ultimately designed to add meat to the bones of the existing policy. 816 also identifies the need for further guidance and the creation of space standards as part of that guidance. And so there is a clear need for a straightforward, consistent document that can help ensure good quality spaces that are sufficient for residents' needs and that are well managed. And this is what we're attempting to do here. So we've divided it into 4 parts, as you can see on the screen: local plan making, planning applications, design standards, and management plan. So the first part, plan making, is specifically to support boroughs in considering how co-living developments can fit into the local context where they might be trying to cater for a broad range of housing needs, and noting the need to maintain mixed and inclusive communities and neighbourhoods that we've talked about before. The guidance supports boroughs if they want to create site allocations or broad area allocations for where co-living might be appropriate, or to manage potential concerns over concentration in certain areas by putting limits on the number of developments in units if that's needed. The second part of the guidance reiterates the locational considerations for co-living schemes in planning applications. The third part, which Monica is going to speak a bit about in a bit, is about design standards, and it particularly focuses on the internal and external space and quality standards in the private and communal spaces. And the last section elaborates more on management plans and that aspect of the policy. So handing back to Monica for design standards. I hope that that was a useful background there, Monica.
Thanks so much, Michaela. I think that was very useful, and hope people also have a sense of why this guidance is needed. So I will now go through some of the highlights of the design standards that we've put in the guidance. And as I mentioned earlier, there's much more detail in the guidance document itself. Uh, So there are some overarching principles for the communal spaces that are provided within these developments. We want to make sure that all of the residents that are living in these developments are able to cook, prepare, and eat their meals comfortably. They are able to relax and socialize, including with if they have visitors. They are able to work from home in this hybrid working environment and do other kind of functional needs that they have, such as laundry. We want these communal spaces to be well designed, adequately sized. They should be inclusive. Uh, they should be good quality, well ventilated spaces, and should be able to be conveniently accessed from all of the different floors and all of the different parts of the development. And these communal spaces should be provided in a sufficient quantity so that it can meet the requirements of the intended number of residents in these developments. The guidance also focuses on that these communal spaces people can use independently, and they instill the sense of community within the community in the development. Just as an example, on the table on the right that you see, the the spaces that will be counted towards the minimum requirements of communal spaces are the ones that you can actually use. So kitchen and dining, living rooms, entertainment areas, or workspaces that are only meant for residents. But the spaces that wouldn't be included, where people cannot really hang out or socialize, are laundry rooms, toilets and storage spaces, circulation spaces, and if there are spaces provided for public use or are being charged for, those will not count towards the communal space requirements. So we have internal communal spaces requirements as well as external communal spaces requirements. So living and lounging spaces will be counted towards those. These can be provided flexibly. These can be a combination of quieter spaces and large spaces for socializing, entertainment, or recreation. We recommend that every floor has some kind of living space, especially if there are no dining or kitchen on a particular level. These spaces should be naturally lit, ventilated, and they should be provided in sufficient amount with comfortable seating, comfortable lighting, so that people can hang out and interact. And the guidance stipulates the requirement of a 5 square meter per resident for internal communal spaces. That includes your kitchen, dining, living, and all the other spaces that I mentioned in the previous slide. For external communal space, we have stipulated a requirement of 1 square meter per resident. So, for instance, if the co-living development has 150 units, 150 square meter outdoor space would be required. Um, the other aspects of the guidance mentions that these spaces should be directly accessible from usable internal communal space, and we would prefer these are provided as large outdoor spaces, either on the ground floor or podium level. But if they are provided in a disaggregated manner, then at least each space should measure 40 square meters, and there should be adequate seating, lighting, landscaping provided in these spaces so they are well used. If private balconies are provided in the units, that wouldn't count towards this external communal space requirement. Um, I also wanted to focus on kitchen and dining spaces. So the guidance stipulates per square meter requirement per resident. Um, these kitchens should be provided so that they can facilitate every resident to cook meals from scratch between the evening hours, so typically 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. The standards per person are derived from understanding the space requirements, from having amenities that you see in the table on the right hand side that can be accommodated in the kitchen. A kitchen that would allow 5 people to cook together can serve maybe around 20 people if each person is cooking for 30 to 45 minutes um, to prepare a meal. Uh, Kitchen and dining spaces are intended to bring people together and create a sense of community. Hence, we have identified that if one kitchen can at least allow 5 people to cook together, that would be a small enough group to have conversations. This is not a requirement, but more of a suggestion. The guidance discourages aggregating all facilities in a few areas. We have seen schemes where the kitchens are provided on every floor, and sometimes if the floor plate is large, they are provided on either side of the floor plate. But we have also seen schemes where there is no kitchen on 40 floors and they are only provided at the top and bottom. So we think that to allow for convenient access, a kitchen on every level uh, would really demonstrate that convenient access. Similarly, there is requirements for dining space per person, assuming uh, that a meal can be a leisurely meal can be done in a 40 to 45-minute time frame. So each dining space can serve 4 to 5 people, hence the requirement of zero point 0.5 square meter per person. If there is any cafe or restaurant that is part of the development which is open to public, that should not be counted towards the kitchen and dining spaces. In terms of the private units, policy 816 requires that these private units are not self-contained homes or capable of being used as self-contained homes, but they should provide functional living space. So the guidance identifies a list of amenities that are expected to be provided. For these reasons, we have established an upper and lower limit of the room sizes. Um, So if you the minimum that you provide is a bed, a double bed, some counter space for um, having a microwave and kettle, wardrobe spaces, ensuite bathroom, toilet, and maybe a study table and a sofa or a two-person seating in the rooms. Based on the policy D5 of the London Plan Inclusive Design, the guidance establishes that at least 10% of the units must be accessible. Also, if the kitchens are not provided on every floor, then accessible units must be provided on the same floors as the kitchens. Qualitative standards of traditional housing, such as natural light, ventilation, noise, etc., will also apply to these co-living developments. So that's policy D6, housing quality standards, part B to E. Now, a little bit about the management plan so that all of the facilities that are provided ensure that there is a robust management in place. Um, so the management plan actually looks at uh, these different aspects of the operations of the building, the security and fire safety procedures. This is dealt much more in detail in the fire safety guidance, but some parts are uh, put in this co-living LPG as well. Making sure the tenant contract strategy is in place so that the tenant there is a minimum 3 month of stay and these units are not cohabited. Uh, how the spaces are managed, cleaned. There are linen changing services and other operations are running smoothly. There will be a churn of people moving in and out, so making sure that there are proper in and out, moving in and out arrangements made so that the operations of the building as well as there is no disturbance to the public realm outside. uh, Making sure that the internal external areas are well maintained so that they are able to be used comfortably all through the year, all through the day. Also, the management plan, which is secured by the Section 106 agreement, should also address the delivery and servicing of the development and other aspects such as waste management. We have also conducted an equality impact assessment, which has informed the guidance to ensure that the guidance has positive impacts whenever relevant for on people with protected characteristics, so that it can be used comfortably by all kinds of people. So that was all in terms of a highlight of what's in the guidance. Public consultation is live now, and this is an opportunity for us to seek your feedback on this guidance. And the best ways to actually fill the online consultation survey, which asks which provides a space for you to put in detailed comments, examples, and we ask questions on different sections of the guidance, such as plan making. Are there enough details or should more be added? There are questions about design standards, specifically for kitchen and communal spaces, and also questions about the management plan. And All of the details of the document and the survey are available on the engagement platform. This is the link here. And the consultation again runs until 27th March. So please let us know your thoughts and comments. We'll really appreciate to include in the final guidance. That's it. Thank you so much. And now I'll hand over to Natalie, who will chair the Q&A session, and I'll stop presenting.
Hi, Monica. Thanks so much, Monica and Michaela, for those really interesting presentations. We've now got about half an hour for the question and answer session, and we've had lots of questions coming through in the chat. So what I will do now is just first of all, we'll start off with a question aimed at Monica. So there's been a couple of questions around the design standards, so I'll just sum them up. But how was the guidance developed, specifically in relation to space standards, such as the 5 square meters per person for internal communal space? Sorry, Monica, did you want to answer that one?
Yes, thanks, Natalie. As I mentioned earlier, in formulating this guidance, we have reviewed a variety of different schemes that have been submitted through planning, particularly the ones that were referred to the mayor. And we have based the standards on how the schemes have provided different spaces, what represents good practice, and also looked at schemes where this practice ought to be avoided. So the standards are therefore, I feel, realistic, and as they're based on these real life examples, which have been proposed by the industry. We have also looked at specific research that has been done for co-living accommodation by Hawkins Brown, CPRE. We have spoken to a number of providers who have different ideas of what they want to offer in their co-living product. It is still an emerging kind of development. And also, we have translated parts of the housing standards, such as the amenity spaces or what kind of equipments should there be in the kitchen and or in the private rooms, and translated those housing standards to develop these guidelines so that appropriate and good quality living can be provided through these co-living schemes. And these standards are proportional, so they apply regardless of the location of the building or the building typology. And I think the viability should not be used as a reason to diminish the quality of life for the residents. I hope that kind of addresses some of the questions we got around this.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Monica. Okay, moving on to the next question. When is the affordable housing SPG being issued, given the knock-on implications of the co-living SPG's requirements on the viability of a scheme? Surely they should go hand in hand. Could you say more about the anticipated requirements relating to affordable housing provision? And I'll direct that question to Michaela.
Thanks, Natalie. No problem. So just to revisit H16 in terms of what it asks for in terms of affordable housing contributions for co-living. So H16 requires co-living to provide a cash in lieu contribution, which is an off-site for off-site C3 affordable housing that boroughs can then use as part of their own build programs or however they wish to. And this is required as an upfront payment or an in perpetuity annual payment. Discounted co-living units are not acceptable as affordable housing because these don't meet the space standards for C3, which I covered very briefly in the presentation. So schemes, excuse me, bear with me, slight technical glitch there, bear with me. So these schemes will follow the viability tested route, but where the contribution is equivalent to 35% of units or 50% for public or industrial land at a 50% discount, there's no late review required. So that's the first thing, just to remind us of the policy context. Now, with the affordable housing and viability, what will be the LPG now, so referred to as London Plan Guidance rather than the old SPG, it will cover a considerable amount more than the affordable housing contributions or viability related matters for co-living developments. And so therefore it has its own programme right now that we're working up, and there's a lot of work going into it. To be clear, this is not going to change the policy position of 816 in terms of the affordable housing contribution that is required. It is on a different timeline to this guidance, and with a draft consultation looking at later in the year. But I would like to note that any comments received relating to affordable housing contributions or viability on co-living, so received as part of this consultation, will be taken into account for that guidance, which will largely be covering the approach of affordable housing contributions already set in H16, rather than making any changes to the policy, which we can't do in any case for an LPG. I think it's worth saying, because there have been some questions that throughout the time we've been discussing co-living, even outside of this formal consultation process, around the tension between design and viability ultimately. And it's worth saying that a number of schemes already meet the proposed standards that we're talking about here. And while it may be that some costs could increase, depending on how you address and deal with your communal areas, higher quality accommodation also attracts higher rents and values, which supports your viability. So we will continue to consider this when developing further guidance on the affordable housing and viability LPG.
Great, thanks very much, Michaela, for that. The next question is policy H16 states that large-scale purpose-built shared living is generally at least 50 units. What happens in shared living schemes between 7 and 50, i.e. bigger than an HMO, but smaller than large-scale purpose-built shared living? And I'll direct that again to you, Michaela. Thanks.
Yep, no problem. So to be clear, there's no requirement for large-scale purpose-built shared living to provide at least 50 units. That's not what the supporting text is saying. It's not necessarily a defining point for co-living. The reference to 50 is indicative, therefore, and was to assist decision makers in identifying developments where H16 would be applicable, given the fact that there's no formal planning definition, or previously there wasn't up until H16, for large-scale purpose-built shared living. And so it's also not considered necessarily to be cost-effective to provide high-quality professional management services, and that includes well-maintained functional and communal spaces for developments that are fewer than 50 homes. And it is also important to differentiate between co-living developments and more traditional large-scale houses in multiple occupation. So this question is about, you know, what happens with the 7 to 50? Well, large-scale houses in multiple occupation are actually 7+. They're just sui generis rather than C4 accommodation. But of course, the main difference is that HMOs don't provide those services to residents. Now, all that said, if a smaller development met the criteria to be co-living under H16, it would be assessed as such, even if it was below that 50. But if not, if it doesn't meet those criteria and its function is clearly that of a large-scale HMO, then there are other industry standards that can be used to assess quality.
Great, thanks a lot for that, Michaela. It's really useful. Okay, moving on to the next question. We've had have you had input from the London Fire Brigade or the Health Safety Executive, as the LFB has specific and negative views on communal space on upper floors? And I'd like to direct that question to Celeste, who is one of our team leaders in the London Plan and Growth Strategies team. Welcome, Celeste.
Thank you, Natalie. So fire safety is covered by London Plan Policy D12, which requires the highest standard of fire safety. And we also have an LPG out on fire safety out for consultation at the moment, and that will run until the 20th of June. So we'd welcome everyone to respond to that specifically. So as I've said, that London Plan policy and the guidance applies to all development. And it asks developers to consider fire safety at the earliest design stage. And this is to ensure developments allocate space for fire engines and fighting equipment outside the building, but also inside the building, that it makes space for things such as evacuation lists, refuges and lobbies. So if there's any specific requirements of co-living, we would expect designers to make space for any extra equipment that's required. We have engaged the London Fire Brigade on the development of the fire safety guidance, and they haven't made any specific comments about co-living, but we can go back and ask them as we engage with them further. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thanks very much, Celeste. That's brilliant. And then next, we've had a couple of questions on this next topic, and I'll just pose it to Monica. So, how does the guidance ensure that there will be sufficient facilities for everyone, such as number of hobs, fridges, freezers, and dishwashers? How did you arrive at the hours for kitchen use?
So, as I've mentioned throughout my presentation, specifically when we were talking about the kitchens, we have systematically calculated how much space is required by each amenity. Say, for instance, for hobs or fridge or dishwashers, and how many people can use these facilities during a particular duration of time. So I acknowledge that not everyone's cooking time will be the same. So we have taken a 2.5 hour window in which people would usually cook. And the dinner times are kind of the peak times when more people will cook. So taking that as typically 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. People coming after work or things like that. And we've also identified that cooking time for a meal from scratch, we anticipate and we would like that these provide quality spaces to cook so that people can cook their meals from scratch and interact with other people in the kitchen. So 30 to 40 minutes. And these basic assumptions, as well as the size standards from the design standards, housing standards, we have come up with specific area requirements that are per resident. Um, so while, for example, while one hob can be used by one person at a time, a fridge or freezer or a dishwasher can be used by multiple people. So the guidance actually identifies number of hobs per resident, or the vice versa. One resident, how many hobs should be provided, and also maybe one fridge could say serve 20 residents. So those details are provided in the guidance, and this is sort of systematically calculated. But if you have alternate suggestions for any of these design standards, we would like to hear from you with examples. So that would be very welcome.
Great, thanks a lot, Monica. And just keeping on this issue, we've had a point around regarding hobs in rooms. Someone commented that this will be difficult to control as some form of a management team could be expected to, in terms of limiting, to control the limitation of cooking once a hob is provided in a room. And a question has been posed around how does the guidance address this? Also, if hobs are provided in rooms, does it mean that less hobs can be provided in communal spaces? So direct that towards you, Monica, again. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. So the kitchenette space in the rooms, I mean, the guidance is very clear about it, is really intended for preparation of convenience food. And therefore the guidance only requires there's provision of plug points for, say, microwave or kettle, but not really hobs or ovens. And the guidance also says that if there are hobs provided, it should be limited to 2 plate hobs. But yeah, I acknowledge that that can be an issue in terms of discouraging people to go to the communal living spaces. And the intention of the guidance is not to have these small units functioning as substandard self-contained units. So it's a good question, and we would like to provide more clarity in the guidance to make sure there is flexibility of what amenities are provided in the private units, but at the same time, these amenities should not discourage the use of the shared spaces. In terms of the second part of the question, if hobs are provided in the room, does it mean less hobs for communal spaces? At this point, the guidance is clear about the requirements of the communal spaces, and it's not and or if it is provided in the private rooms, the communal space requirements do not become less. So it's independent of what is provided in the rooms. I think this is something that we may need to think about a little more in detail in terms of to make sure that the quality and quantity of communal spaces are not compromised by what's provided in the rooms. At the same time, again, sort of reiterating that discouraging the use of rooms as substandard homes is one of the main intentions of this guidance, and to have that sense of community developed through the use of communal spaces. So we will look into this further as part of the feedback from this consultation. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thanks a lot, Monica. And the next question I'll direct towards Celeste. We've had a couple of questions around this, but around how the housing standards don't apply to this sui generis use. How do you ensure adequate quality related to aspect, daylight, etc.? Also, how do you ensure adequate standards for accessible units?
Thanks, Natalie. So I guess the policy H12, which covers co-living, requires developments to be of a good quality. And then policy D6 of the London Plan also requires amenity considerations to be included as part of the development considerations. So that's things like maximising dual aspect dwellings, ensuring sufficient daylight and sunlight, ventilation. I guess these schemes are slightly different in that the rooms are smaller, so getting that dual aspect per room may be more difficult, but we'd expect applicants to address these amenity issues and consider the amenity of the shared spaces and the private spaces. And as Monica said, making sure that I guess this balance needs to ensure that the communal spaces are adequately spaced and designed to encourage their use, and that we're not just encouraging people to stay in substandard self-contained units. And I guess that's one of the whole reasons of this design guide, is to ensure there's adequate amenity space, adequate shared space, and then outdoor space as well. And then in terms of access, yes, so part what are they called? The access standards that we have in the London Plan don't apply specifically to this. We generally apply the standards that we would apply to visitor accommodation. That's part of E10, I think, of the London Plan. But we can review those because we've had some other feedback about using the room size from one part of the building regs and perhaps the bathroom sizes from another. So we can clarify that in the final guidance. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thanks very much, Celeste. That's really helpful. Now moving on to, we've got a question from Michaela, I think. So we do not yet know very much about the likely demographics of those who will use co-living developments as they increase in number. Why do we need to be so prescriptive about the facilities to be provided?
Thanks, Natalie. I think it's a good point that we don't know everything about co-living developments and how that's going to play out, but we are clear that co-living developments, given their size in terms of the private space and the rent levels, which are not affordable rents, are single occupancy units, and for those that don't have affordable housing needs. And so whilst that, as I say, doesn't mean we know everything about the demographic of those that are taking up co-living tenancies or that will take them up, they are ultimately designed for those with cash flow, which usually means job security, and who do not have dependents, and that for whatever reason don't want to take on maybe more traditional tenancies in the existing private rented sector, or that may even just want to live in a kind of more communal way as a single occupant with other people. So in any case, I think the technical standards and requirements that we're describing within the guidance or the draft guidance are there to ensure like a decent level of design that provides good quality of life for people in general. And I don't necessarily see this as something that would be, this would be required regardless of the demographic you were talking about. So, you know, it's a kind of a basic threshold to make sure you have that quality of life. But I'd say also that policy and guidance provide enough flexibility to ensure that residents' needs are met if there are major changes in the demographic that are taking these up. But we do not see that going beyond single occupancy, and we do not see it as an affordable housing offer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Great. Thanks a lot, Michaela. And then we've got another question on, are there any requirements for communal toilets in communal areas? And I'll direct that towards Monica.
Yes, actually, the guidance does require communal toilets so that if there are visitors and guests who are visiting the residence, they are able to use the facilities as well within these communal spaces.
Great, thanks, Monica. And then we've got a question, why does the guidance and the equality impact assessment refer to on-site provision of affordable housing? And I'll direct that to you, Michaela.
Thanks, Natalie. It's a pretty easy answer. The guidance and equalities impact assessment does reference affordable housing with regards to the need for boroughs to consider for a range of housing options in their areas. So they're required to consider this where co-living is proposed, and that range of housing options that they're considering might also be for any potential on-site affordable housing that could be needed or delivered outside of this being a co-living scheme. So this is part of, and going back to the presentation, this is part of ensuring that mixed and inclusive communities that is an overarching agenda of the London Plan. And so what we're saying there is that in making your considerations, you should be looking at delivering these mixed and inclusive communities and preventing mono-tenure delivery. It's not a suggestion in the guidance or the EQIA that large-scale purpose-built shared living should provide on-site affordable accommodation itself, which would not be appropriate, as we continue to say, because of the fact that it doesn't meet space standards in the same way that traditional homes does.
Great, thanks a lot, Michaela. Then we've got a question, can the individual rooms have their own kitchen but not bathroom, or vice versa, and still fall within the policy? And I'll direct that towards Monica.
Great, thanks, Natalie. The short answer is no. The ensuite bathroom is required as part of the private units, and as I mentioned earlier, the kitchen space is mostly for just convenience food preparation and not really for a full-fledged kitchen cooking. So yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Monica. And then for Celeste, I've got a question around what considerations have been made for waste management.
Thanks, Natalie. I guess this goes back to the good quality design aspects of the schemes. So within rooms and communal spaces, we would expect adequate provision for waste storage, and that's in line with London Plan Policy SI7. And that would be for the ability to separate recyclables and food waste from general waste, and then for it all to be collected and sufficient storage and collection space in a communal, not in a communal area, but in a kind of facilities area for the whole building. And the management plan would address the kind of wider management of waste on site. But we've had a few questions on this, so perhaps we'll just have another look and make it a bit clearer. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thanks very much, Celeste. And then we've got a question around why the GLA is considering imposing a maximum size to room sizes, and will this not be negatively seen by public opinion? So I'll direct that to Michaela.
Yep. So the overarching point of co-living or large-scale purpose-built shared living is the communal aspect to the development. What allows it to have smaller room sizes in general is the fact that it's providing such a good communal offer, so that people aren't spending the majority of their time in their bedrooms, they're spending it in the wider development, and then their bedroom is their private space, which is the unit. So this is quite unlike, say, build to rent development, where you are a self-contained unit. So the range size is therefore to ensure that rooms are not so small that they're poor quality, but they're not so large that they encourage self-containment and then function as self-contained accommodation by design. Because if they were to be so large to do that, so for example, say you provided 4 kitchens and you made the maximum area, a maximum size of the unit larger, then we would, by design, be promoting self-containment, and then you would just be in a position where we would have smaller than average, ultimately build to rent accommodation, and that's not what we want here. We're very clear that this is a different product, and that is why there is a maximum, which seems quite different, I think, to other forms of accommodation, but we have to recognise that it is quite different, and therefore a different set of standards and technical requirements are needed.
Great, thanks, Michaela. And then we've got a question around, have you considered the needs of people with more introverted tendencies who do not necessarily want to socialise when they're in their own home? And I'll direct that to Monica.
Yes, thanks, Natalie. The guidance does talk about providing quieter communal spaces and sort of disaggregated communal spaces where people with introvert tendencies may be able to interact. And also it provides functional spaces within the private rooms. But at the same time, this type of communal living may not be fully appropriate for people specifically with neurodiverse needs. So this doesn't, the nature of the communal living might not be appropriate overall for such people, but there are, the guidance does sort of address the needs, the varying needs of different people to not interact in large groups or to be able to be by themselves or in quieter spaces. I hope that answers their question.
Great,
I think it's
thanks.
worth just saying there that that's why, you know, ultimately we need a range of housing delivered onto the market for a range of different needs, and why when we're looking at co-living or considering co-living, we must always be considering that as part of a wider delivery, and not focus on any idea that we're suggesting that this would meet general needs or all needs. This is a product that has a kind of specific target within the market, if you like.
Great, thanks both Monica and Michaela for that. And then we've got a question, sort of, I guess it's a little bit related, but it's how could this co-living offer be made attractive for elderly and younger people, not just singles, and for people who have friends, family and visitors visiting them? So shouldn't there be a provision for guest rooms? Monica, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. I think it's very related to the conversation we just had, and Michaela mentioning that there is a need for a range of housing. Although the guidance does require all spaces to be accessible and to be independently used. So yes, this could provide accommodation for elderly singles or younger people. The policy or the guidance doesn't specify any user groups, but this also doesn't address all of the needs for elderly people that are addressed by the older person specialist housing policy. So again, co-living is not an answer for all of the needs, but the guidance does provide enough flexibility to accommodate any user group who would like to live in these accommodation. The next part of the question, the guidance does say that the communal facility should be able to accommodate friends and visitors who come to visit the residence. But it's a good question about the guest rooms. There is a minimum tenancy requirement of 3+ months. And this is something that we'll take away and see if this needs to be specifically addressed through the guidance.
Great, thanks very much, Monica. And we've got a question around why the guidance focuses on single occupants, and they refer to families such as a young single mum with a child, for example, and whether this type of accommodation might be something that's could be of interest. So I'll direct that towards Michaela.
Yeah, again, I think very similar to what we've been saying in terms of other groups and needs. So it's designed for single person households who choose not to live in self-contained homes or HMOs, as we've covered, for whatever reason. And the management plan is very important. is a very important part of ensuring that, you know, there's questions over how you ensure that single occupancy point. Well, that management plan is part of any application and would need to make clear that this is the case, that it's single occupancy, and so therefore it's for the provider ultimately to continue to ensure that that is the case. So because co-living doesn't constitute a form of affordable housing or housing that meets general needs, the units are smaller than self-contained homes and aren't required to meet certain standards that self-contained homes might, not just in terms of size. Let's say typically developments might need to provide play space, for example, for children, and that's not the case here. Then it's simply that they're not a suitable form of accommodation for families and children, and that needs to be met elsewhere in the market. So young single mums should be being provided for outside of any co-living offer.
Great, thanks, Makada, for clarifying that. And then we've just got just one or two final questions if we've got time, but it's one of them is focused on cycle parking requirements. So Monica, could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the cycle parking requirements for co-living development is the same as the single occupancy studio units. So the London plan requires that there is a long stay cycle parking provided for every unit and one short stay for every, I think, 20 units for visitors. We have heard from providers for different schemes that this is ambitious, and I think we want to be ambitious in these requirements to make sure that London is a safe cycling friendly city for all. And as mentioned earlier, that these developments are provided in well-connected locations. So we would like people to be able to walk, cycle to the different destinations, and that is enabled only when there are secure cycle parking spaces for residents. Yeah, the ambitious cycle parking requirements also can be used to optimize the density of these developments. We have seen schemes that are 800 plus units. So trying to sort of understand how that can be managed in terms of making sure these provide quality communal spaces, cycle storage spaces, and all of the other amenities that we have talked about. So yeah, and these will be looked at case by case basis in terms of what can be appropriately provided in these developments.
Thanks a lot, Monica. And finally, I've got a question for Celeste, and that's: do you see similarities between co-living and student accommodation, and can these standards be used for student housing?
Thanks, Natalie. So I guess while both products are non-self-contained products, they do cater for a different market. So student housing obviously caters for the university and tertiary sector, and they have different requirements. For example, we wouldn't necessarily require cooking facilities or meal preparation within a room. Some boroughs I know require a variety of unit types, so some clusters and some single occupancy. Whereas co-living, we would expect more communal facilities, so, you know, more shared living space, shared kitchens, and the student accommodation, student facilities may be found on campus instead of within the kind of student housing building. So there are differences between the two products, and also for student housing, we require affordable student rooms to be provided within the scheme and tied ideally to a university.
I think there's also maybe a tenancy point there too, isn't there, Celeste? Which is, you know, student accommodation typically would run the academic year, which is the 38 weeks-ish to 40 weeks. And that's not what we're going for here. It's not necessarily a stipulated period of time. We want a minimum because, you know, that part of ensuring those mixed and inclusive communities is, you know, that there isn't massive churn. So it's not used as a hostel or hotel accommodation, but it may well be that your length of tenancy is considerably longer if you wanted to stay in co-living, which is, I think, very unusual for student accommodation. Even if you wanted to stay in student accommodation yourself for years, you wouldn't necessarily have the same unit. yeah, just an extra thought on that.
Great. Well, that's brilliant. Thanks, everyone. That wraps up the question and answer session. I just want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you very much to the panelists, and particularly thanks everyone for all your questions. If you've got any more questions, please do send them to us via the consultation email address. So that's lspbsl consultation@london.gov.uk. And just a reminder that the consultation closes on Sunday, the 27th of March. If you would like to know anything more about the consultation, please feel free to visit our consultation hub at www.consult.london.gov.uk. Monica, was there anything you wanted to say as a final word? Otherwise, we'll close.
No, I think this has been a good session. I hope the questions that were posed during the registration as well as in the Q&A panel have addressed some of the doubts that people had. And again, I would welcome feedback on the through the survey that we have, detailed feedback, so that we can consider that in putting together our final guidance. Thanks again, and thanks to all of you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.